for a lifetime, and I have been hooked on investigative reporting ever since. And I've told any number of young people, not because I'm some wise old man, but because I've been a few miles and seen a few things, that be careful when you get into investigative reporting, because if you really get into it, it can be more addictive than crack cocaine. Among the things I learned at that moment in Deep East Texas was how hard it can be to dig out things that people, especially powerful people, don't want the public to know, which very often, more often than not I think, turn out to be things that your fellow citizens need to know. I also learned that when you do this kind of reporting, not everybody is going to love you or respect you for it. And when your reporting is right, even when it's right, you will catch hell and you will pay a price. Then, too, there was a lesson that you'd better be prepared to defend every word, every single piece of this kind of reporting, that you must be prepared to defend it well and immediately. And also, unless you're fortunate, very fortunate, you may sometimes have difficulty getting your superiors to stand up for you and stand by you and stand with you. Besides all that, I learned, especially in investigative reporting, there is no room or excuse for making, whining, or blaming bad luck. Now, you can say that that first story contained in it all the lessons that I would need to know about investigative reporting. Over the years, there have been many occasions when these lessons have been put to use, sometimes arguably well, I'd like to think, sometimes arguably not so well. I know when I covered the civil rights movement in the South in the early days, covered the White House, when I worked on the one-hour documentary series, CBS Reports, when I worked on the original 60 Minutes before becoming anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News, and literally hundreds of other times before and after those assignments, it was always important to keep in mind the basics, the fundamentals. However well or unwell I learned from and acted on those lessons over the years, I'll leave for you to decide. I submit them to you tonight for whatever, if any, value they may have, as those of you who are journalists, and or those of you who aspire to be journalists, or those who have nothing really to do with journalism except as consumers, those of you who are citizens, to consider what's at base what I've just told you in these stories. If they have any value as you carry forward with your own important work, whatever that work is. And suggest if you're saying to yourself, well, Mr. Rather, I know all those lessons well, backward and forward. That is never a bad time to review them again. As for myself, I go forward dedicated to trying to do more, not less, investigative reporting. I do so believing that the need for quality journalism, and most especially investigative reporting in the best sense of that phrase, has never been greater. Let me discuss for a moment another example, which is from my own past, but is on a much greater canvas. The Watergate case of the 1970s. And I fully recognize some of the young people in the audience, and I'm not being patronizing to you, to talk about something that happened in the 1970s may seem as far back to you as Caesar's campaigns. We had a case, and it still sort of sticks in my throat to say so. We had a case that started small, was exposed by two investigative reporters, but grew into a case of a widespread criminal conspiracy, guided at least in part by the President of the United States himself. Now, this story is fairly well known in journalism circles, and anybody over the age, let's say maybe 35 or 40, knows at least the rough outline of it. The shorthand of that story of widespread criminal abuses, led at least in part by the President himself, comes under the general heading of, quote, Watergate. It's a shorthand way of saying it. No doubt it inspired people in journalism. The whole story, once it came out, particularly the story that investigative journalism played in it, because the story served to buttress the belief and the understanding of all of us, in journalism or out, that we had the potential, journalists have the potential, to have great impact, and quality journalism with integrity can matter. But a long time before Watergate, it was, well, whatever you do, it doesn't matter. That was a widespread belief, particularly among journalists. It's not going to crack through whatever you do. Whatever you do. The powerful will somehow find some way to suppress it, or the public will just yawn and turn the other way. But one of the things that Watergate did for us all, who were practicing reporters at the time, and did for us as citizens of the nation, is to put the lie to that in somewhat the same way that may have inspired people in this room, some of you, to get into journalism in the first place. I want to come to the point here. I wonder at times to myself, and I have questions that I want to share with you now, about whether we in this room, including the American public that's out there in our vast country, do we still believe and understand the importance of the things we did then, that is, the journalists did then? Do they understand it? Does the public understand it? Do we journalists, and those of us who aspire to be journalists, understand it as well now? It is, as I mentioned before, after all, something that happened a long time ago. An example, do we or do we not still believe that the very real lessons of Vietnam, Watergate, the Iran-Contra debacle, the entry into the war in Iraq, the Clinton impeachment, and any number of more recent stories during both Republican and Democratic administrations, do we still believe that the people need to understand government, how it works, how it really works, better? Do we still believe that those are the lessons out of what I mentioned, the Watergate period? Not how the government is supposed to work, not how it appears to work, not how it appears someone wants us to believe it works, but how our government really does and does not work. Do we still believe that that is one of the lessons? And do we understand now that Deep Throat was for years, anonymous source that started the Watergate story by saying to one reporter and then two what he knew, with the understanding they wouldn't use his name. Years later, not too long ago, he revealed himself. He revealed himself not as some mystical creation, a Watergate source, but as a flesh and blood insider who had an important story to get out. Do we, and again I'm talking about the public at large as well as those of us who are in journalism and aspire to journalism, do we understand just how valuable the unnamed source, properly used, can be to quality journalism? I suspect that you may be seeing a message, yes, we understand. A question, do our fellow Americans understand it? Do we understand and have we spread the word about the need to protect our prerogative to make use of the unnamed source without fearing censure or imprisonment? Let me add a quick note at the bottom of the page, and I do not accept myself in this criticism. All of us who are in journalism know that anonymous sources are used far too much, and by overusing them, we journalists have undercut our credibility. But the simple point is, do we understand that we need to protect the use, the proper use, of the unnamed source, and why it is in the public interest that we do so? Do we still believe the dictum, which I believe down in my marrow, that news is what somebody, somewhere, wants to suppress, and that all the rest is just advertising? Another way to put it is news, a definition of news, is what's important for people to know, that somebody in power somewhere doesn't want us to know. That's news. And all the rest is mostly advertising. Do we still believe, in a paraphrase of what Walter Lippmann once wrote, that it is our responsibility to find out what is going on beneath the surface and tell people what it means so they can judge how well or how poorly their government and their leaders are serving them? Do we still believe that the press in its watchdog role should provide information for and spur a sensible appraisal of government's policies, and appraisals of people in government at all levels, especially high levels? Do we still believe that, as journalists, do we, as Americans at large, still believe that, or not? Do we understand, as journalists, and people who are outside of journalism who are interested in it, do we understand just how much work it takes to do these things and do them well, to create a product of quality journalism? Are we willing to find ways to do it no matter what the medium? Are we, as consumers of media, willing to find ways to encourage those that do it in our media, to find ways to make detailed accounts arresting if we journalists work in print, and to find ways to get beneath the surface of just pictures and sound bites if we work in television and radio? Another question, do we still believe that no matter how ever present the reporters, cameras, microphones, and incessant questions, government officials, and the higher up they are, the more it's true, government officials have tremendous, frequently overwhelming power to manufacture their own reputations, to paint the picture the public gets of themselves and their policies instead of the reality. Now let me digress for a moment.